To what degree has the recent news flow around the Italian budget exposed the fragility of the European Union? Jean-Claude Juncker said that if other EU nations were given the support or treatment that Italy requested, that is to extend the economy's debt to GDP to 2.4%. Certainly that was the initial view from the Italian government. It would mean the end of the euro, according to Juncker. Just words, or is it reality? Well, joining us now is Charles Hecker, Senior Partner at Control Risks. I think we have to put what I said there into some sort of context, because Italy has rode back from that initial point at which it wanted that 2.4% of GDP. Is this brinkmanship? What's going on here between the two parties?
Yeah, I think what you're going to see for the foreseeable future between Brussels and Rome is a rhetorical war of words. Juncker is probably exaggerating when he says that the Italian budget will be the end of the euro. Bear in mind that Italian support for the euro, for the single currency, and Italian support for the European Union are both very, very high and polling at about 70% popularity in Italy. So what you have right now is a little bit of friction about the way Italy is putting together its budget. Juncker would like to see any deficit spending under 2%. Italy has said, well, we're going to try to come in at 2.4%, which is the source of the friction. Italy was taking previously a much harder stance. They're already saying that now in 2020, we'll try harder and we'll bring it in under your requested levels.
What about Italian politics? It seems to me as though we are running along two distinct lines here. There's a lot of disagreement between the President's office and the PM's office. How do you see that relationship developing within Italy?
Yeah, that's a superb question. So the problem with Italy and its budget, by the way, the budget conversations are the most pitched political crisis in Italy right now. And you have essentially a two-headed government run by both a sort of left-wing and a right-wing coalition, both of which want very different things out of this budget, and neither of them are compromising. The right-wing part of the government wants very deep budget cuts. The left-wing part of the government wants very high expenditures. They want to introduce, this is the part of the government led by the M5S movement, the left-wing movement that wants a monthly €500 universal income support payment. That's a very expensive gesture that you can't pay for with budget cuts that Matteo Salvini, who's on the right-wing side of the government, is insisting on. So they have mutually decided to borrow, and that is the short-term way forward for the Italian budget.
And how's that gone down in Brussels?
Not very well at all. There is a 3% cap from Brussels on deficit spending in budgets, but Brussels can't really do anything other than make this sort of noise that Jean-Claude Juncker is making now. They can't veto the Italian budget. It's going to the Parliament in November, and it will be passed and it will be enacted. And there is really nothing that Brussels specifically can do other than yell and make a bit of noise.
One of the things that happened, I think one of the lessons I guess they learned from Greece was the fact that there was very bad tax collection in Greece. Is that the same in Italy, or is Italy in a better position with the collection of tax and the way in which they're organising themselves fiscally?
Well, Italy is probably in a better position than Greece when it comes to its fiscal position. The Italian economy is actually growing. It's growing at less than 1%, but there is steady growth in the Italian economy. And one of the primary previous sources of concern, which was the Italian banking system, seems to be in slightly better shape than earlier assumed. There was a stress test of Italian banks, the results of which I think will be made available or will be revealed in November. And by and large, even under the conditions of that stress test, the Italian banks are holding their own.
Yeah, one of the things about Italy is that we've seen, as you say, the Five-Star Party, and I think there's an element of that. I think in the last couple of days we've seen more commentary about the fact that we'd be in a far better position, Italy would be in a far better position if we had our own currency. Now, we all know that it's possible to move currencies up and down in the market to benefit your economy. And, of course, you can't do that with the euro, which, of course, is the big bugbear for those that want to go back to the lira. Is there really that much of a movement to go back to the lira? You said at the top the fact that there's an overwhelming majority that has a support of the euro, but they do understand that that's has a very limiting effect, or can't expand the economy as much as they would otherwise like to do had they had their own currency.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. When you hear the rhetoric about wanting to leave the euro, or when you hear euro bashing or EU bashing coming out of Rome, take that with a tiny pinch of salt because it's aimed at the domestic audience. So never forget the underlying role of domestic politics in international affairs. This plays really well in populist politics, which have Italy in a very firm grip right now. And so a little bit of EU bashing goes a long way. Domestically, Italy needs a convenient scapegoat for some of its domestic political and financial, economic, and migration problems. And the EU, as we all know, is a fairly common punching bag, not just for Italy.
Yeah, how fragile, on a general note, is the EU, do you think? I mean, Juncker there, you were saying, perhaps maybe take it with a bit of salt, what he said about the euro itself. But do you think that the EU itself is a little bit closer to a worrisome edge, if you like, than many you might hope?
Yeah, sometimes the European Union is behaving as if it is, and you can see that, of course, in the Brexit negotiations, where the European Union has taken a relatively hard line because they don't want to encourage anybody else either to leave the Union or to leave the single currency. I think that reports of the EU's death are exaggerated and premature, that the EU is robust, it's resilient, and I think the other thing that we know about the EU is that it's very, very good at muddling through, whether it's a currency crisis or whether it's a political crisis. The EU manages to get through most of its worries by a muddled consensus, and there'll be more of that to come.
Those arguments are that if the EU is actually that good, the UK would never be leaving. And of course, again, if the EU is that good, no one else would want to leave either. So the EU is peddling a very strange position in that regard. Why is it not being more positive about the attributes of the European Union and the Eurozone geopolitically?
Well, interestingly, that was an element that was missing from the Remain campaign in the UK. Very few proponents of staying within the European Union were actually trumpeting its advantages, whether they are in education or whether they are in foreign policy or whether it is the market and the economic strength of the world's largest political and economic bloc. And I think when push comes to shove, and whether it's Italy or any other country other than the UK, when they take a very hard look at what life outside the EU might mean for them, I think they'll think twice.
How fragile is the Eurozone then to a no-deal Brexit? Nathalie Loiseau, part of the French Prime Minister's office, has been reported in the last 24 hours as saying that a no-deal is better than a bad deal. This is apparently words that she gave on French radio, but she has said to Macron. Do you think that's really the right line that the French should be taking?
Well, the French are taking, and Emmanuel Macron are taking the hardest of the hard lines against the UK when it comes to Brexit. The damage to the EU, the damage to the Eurozone as a result of Brexit, when it comes to economic forecasts, we rely on a joint venture partner called Oxford Economics, who does the macroeconomic forecasting. And according to Oxford Economics, the impact will be the highest, of course, on Ireland, and then after that, perhaps on countries like the Netherlands. But after that, the impact of a no-deal Brexit on EU GDP, country by country, actually drops off fairly dramatically within the zone of what is tolerable. So I think that the risks to the EU, the risks to the currency, are probably a little bit lower than everybody is saying right now.
So if we do get a no deal, are you suggesting perhaps maybe then that Ireland ought to come to our side and perhaps maybe try and find a way to extricate themselves from not just the EU, but of course the euro as well?
No, I probably wouldn't go that far at all. In fact, it's exactly for countries like Ireland that the EU is an enormous source of leverage, benefit, and advantage. And you've seen the EU come to, in inverted commas, the rescue of Ireland, and the amount of support it's thrown politically at Ireland in Ireland's negotiations with the UK over the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
Okay, so to control risks, what's your best expected outcome for the negotiations between the UK and the EU?
Well, we do not forecast a no-deal Brexit. Certainly the likelihood of a no-deal exit has risen, but it hasn't crossed the 50% threshold into our most likely scenario. Our most likely scenario is, again, some of this unbeatable EU muddle and a little bit of kicking things down the can, where we think that there will be a sort of linguistically comfortable arrangement struck by March 29th, where the details will be worked out in, of course, this 2-year transition period that we think will also be a feature of the exit.
Okay, well, let's hope it's smooth, whichever way it goes. But Charles, in the meantime, thanks indeed for joining us.
Pleasure.
Charles Hecker is Senior Partner at Control Risks.